Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you Ark's top 10 most underrated tames. In at number 10 is the Angler. Now this thing was released way back, and I do definitely fondly remember this thing from Squid's old Ark series, and his last episode on the Bongoman's Island map was taming the Anglerfish, and still to this day this is actually a pretty useful creature for some certain specific Ark tasks, especially with their silica pearl gathering abilities, and that is pretty much all they have going for them. But silica pearls, if you didn't know already, are an extremely useful Ark resource, so that is why they are an extremely useful Ark creature which many people don't talk or even tame at all, and they just don't question it as a creature. They'll always go for something else. And yes, there are better sea creatures out there, but the Angler is great earlier on to mid-game stages in Ark, where you can't fully shell out for the most powerful ocean tames, but you still want to farm all of those silica pearls to get your fabrication up to the max. These creatures are really worth the tame at some point, as they aren't difficult at all, and they are extremely useful for gathering up all of those silica pearls. In at number 9 is the Chalicotherium. Now you may think this creature is just utterly useless, or you may think this creature is an absolutely insane tame and 100% worth it. And I'm kind of leaning more onto that side, as this creature does have a lot of abilities which many other creatures don't have. And also, the Chalicotherium has an absolutely insane knockback attack, and it is just a generally good creature for just dealing a lot of damage. It's a bit like a slightly worse Megatherium, which really does pack a punch, and it actually is a very decent travel mount as well. It has a very respectable speed stat, one of what you will not complain with at all, and it does have a wealth of other abilities as well, like it being able to throw literal rocks of, I think, even feces at the enemy player. But this ability will take some time to actually practice and get right, as it is a somewhat difficult ability to control, but when done right, it is a really fun, cool ability which does have many uses as well, as it essentially makes this thing a long-range fighting dinosaur, which many other Ark creatures simply do not have. The only one I can really think of off of hand is the Velonasaur's turret ability. In at number 8 is the Carbonemys. Now I know this will be a somewhat unpopular opinion among many of you, but in my opinion, my personal opinion, I really do enjoy the Carbonemys in the early stages of my Ark playing. In those early stages, it is extremely useful to get yourself a creature that can grind all of that oil and those silica pearls and all of those underwater resources. Yes, I will definitely agree this isn't the best creature out there to gather all of those berries and just harvest general things, as I'm pretty sure this thing can't even gather berries, but if it can, it is still an extremely slow Ark creature, which isn't great on land at all. But when it comes into the water, the Carbonemys does actually have some reasonable speed. And yes, just for reference, this B-roll does have some boosted speed on the Carbonemys, as I think it just looks really funny, and it definitely is really funny in my opinion. Comment down below if you think a really fast Carbonemys waggling its little legs really quickly is funny. You know, some people do, and I'm definitely one of those people. But yes, as you can see here in the B-roll, this is me going to gather some oil from the kind of depths of the ocean. Not obviously right to the bottom, as that wouldn't be great, as your player would simply run out of oxygen. As the time when you're getting the Carbonemys, you will not have the scuba tank. I'm pretty confident you won't. So yeah, you can always go into those lakes and lower lying rivers, and there you'll find some oil and definitely some silica pearls, and that is where I think the Carbonemys really shines the most. In at number 7 is the Beelzebufo. Now I know loads of people on my channel really do not feel as if the Beelzebufo is underrated, and they extremely love this creature, and they think it is one of the most popular Ark creatures. And among quite a lot of Ark players, the Beelzebufo is definitely very popular for its cementing paste gathering abilities. But the fact is, a lot of Ark players as well will simply discount the Beelzebufo, and I was one of them before I tried it, as they will just simply say beaver dams are the most efficient way to gather cementing cementing paste, and there isn't a point of spending all of that time to get yourself one of these absolutely amazing, charming Ark frogs, which now obviously I have turned my opinion over is simply not the case. In insect caves like the one on the island, the Beelzebufo really does shine, and you can gather thousands and thousands of cementing paste. And with Ark being a buggy game as well, sometimes beaver dams don't even spawn and can be an absolute nuisance to find, so knowing that you can literally just find some insects on a Beelzebufo to get that cementing paste is actually extremely useful as well, where you just can't find beaver dams and you just can't find that cementing paste. The Beelzebufo is definitely the best creature out there for reliable, quick cementing paste gathering. In at number 6 is the Castoroides. Now again, you may be kind of on the edge like the Beelzebufo with this creature, as you may either love it or hate it. These creatures do seem to be quite Marmite creatures, as you may just not see the use in taming a Castoroides. But before you have the chainsaw in Ark, the Castoroides is one of the best creatures for gathering wood. And you all know wood is a resource which you will need a lot of throughout the game, right from the beginning all the way to the end stages of the Ark game. You will need all of that wood. The amount of wood that you will need in one Ark map playthrough is absolutely insane, and the beaver will really help you to actually get you there. And also the beaver is an extremely fast creature as well, and great in the water too, so it is a sort of upgrade to the Carbonemys if you still can't get a creature that is underwater capable that actually spawns in the water, like the Megalodon or Ichthyosaurus or Plesiosaurus or Mosasaurus, which you may not have at the stage when you'll be taming these things. And also on top of that, they have an extra little special spicy ability as well, which makes them really nice to use. The fact is, their saddle is just a really nice portable smithy, extremely useful. In at number 5 is the Spinosaurus, and what a creature this is, and also in my opinion, what an underrated carnivore, as the Rex always seems to take the spotlight away from the Spinosaurus. And in my opinion, the Spinosaurus is pretty much what a Rex is, and in some cases it can be easier to tame, as it does spawn in less hostile environments, and it definitely has a lot of really great uses that the Rex simply can't partake in. Firstly, it has a really amazing turning circle, which the Rex simply can't compete with, as it can turn 360 on the spot, whereas the Rex's turning circle is absolutely atrocious, and in many situations it is so bad you can even get your Rex killed because it can't turn around and attack the creature that is attacking by its feet. Also, the Spinosaurus is great in the water too, and I'm pretty sure it does have an oxygen stat, even though it may not as well. I'm kind of a bit in between. It may have had one in the past and now it doesn't. Either way, its oxygen stat is really great, and it is a great underwater creature with creatures like the Baryonyx, the Mosasaurus, the Plesiosaurus, the Basilosaurus. The list literally goes on for underwater creatures, and unlike most underwater creatures and pretty much every creature apart from this and the Shadowmane, it has the hydration buff, so it will do even more damage when in water, which is just simply great, as with any carnivore you always like to have a buff. Sadly, it does not have the bleed ability, but still, that hydration buff is absolutely OP, and when it goes back onto its hind legs, this thing will do even more damage on top of that. It is definitely a great boss creature, and actually overall, I'm pretty sure it does more damage than the Rex, as it can attack faster, and I think its damage stat is higher. Its only real downside is its health is slightly worse than something like a Rex. In at number 4 is the Baryonyx. Now, this creature is definitely one of my favorites, and one creature that I will never forget in my Ark journey, and I'm surprised that so many other people don't talk about this to the extent that I do. And yes, it is not the most underrated creature out there, but I definitely think every single Ark player should have a Baryonyx in their roster of creatures, and they should know how to tame one effectively, efficiently, and know how to use one effectively as well. Yes, Shadowmanes are really great for caves now, but still the Baryonyx is my go-to 100%, as obviously its size means that this thing can fit into pretty much any cave. and compared to the Shadowmane, I'm just more used to using the Baryonyx, and yes, it may not be quite as versatile in terms of travel. In my opinion, this thing is still extremely useful and deserves a use, even though in some cases it is somewhat overtaken by the Shadowmane. Except the Shadowmane doesn't have the secret little ability that the Baryonyx has hidden up its sleeve. When it's in the water, it can literally stun creatures if you press C. And yes, the Shadowmane may have the hydration buff and things like that. The Shadowmane is a really great creature, don't get me wrong. It's just for things like caving and underwater exploration, I will always go Baryonyx before Shadowmane. And I would urge you to do that too. And also, they are a lot more accessible than the Shadowmane, as they do spawn on the island. Yes, I know the Shadowmane can be found on Fjorda, at least I'm pretty sure it can be found on Fjorda. So it is free to every Ark player out there, apart from Switch, I think doesn't have Fjorda yet, and obviously mobile doesn't. But on spawning on the island, it really does mean that this creature is the most accessible that it can be. Definitely worth the tame. In at number 3 is the Allosaurus. Yet again, another carnivore, which some people again may say they use all the time. But I really think the Allosaurus does not get the press that it really deserves, like the Spinosaurus and the Bary, as the Allo is by far one of the best boss creatures in Ark in general. And yes, the Rex may have more health, but the Allosaurus does an extremely immense amount of damage in packs, and it is just by far one of the most useful combat creatures in Ark. And with its pack buff, which obviously it will get from being in a pack, it can be buffed even more than a Rex can. And if you combine that with UT buffs on top of that, and the Daedon healing everything, you can have yourself a really great boss environment with Allos. And if you do breeding and mutations, you can have yourself an absolutely insane pack of Allos. And they don't tend to be as absolutely mind-bogglingly stupid as a Rex. These things will pretty much never get stuck on anything in the Ark terrain. And also, if you're doing the Overseer on the island, I would probably recommend bringing Allos, as getting through the tech cave with Rexes, just those Rexes, man, they will just get stuck in the lava and they will just die, and they'll just fall in the most stupid places, and it is really infuriating trying to retrieve them. So I will always use something like the Allo or the Spino if I'm feeling like it for the Overseer boss on the island. And I've only used Rexes once, and I completely regret it, as pretty much all of my army was killed in the tech cave, as all of the Rexes just decided, I don't want to live anymore, and I'm just going to jump straight into that lava. But obviously the Allo does not have any of those issues, and unlike the Rex, it has the all famous bleed ability. Definitely a carnivore to be proud and worth taming. In at number 2 is the Mantis. Now again, this is one of Ark's most accessible creatures, with this thing spawning on maps like Raasclark. And yes, albeit it may not have the easiest taming method out there, requiring you to passive feed it woolly rhino horns on Raasclark, or you can use Deathworm horns as well, and you will have to use Deathworm horns on the original map that it came on, which is Scorched Earth. And I get that many people do recognize the Mantis out there, but like the others, I really think everyone should have a Mantis in their roster, as some people may think it's just weak, useless, not worth it. Why even bother with all the prep and all of that just effort to get yourself some really good Mantises? And to that, I would say they are extremely great harvesters, and on a map like Raasclark, these are by far the go-to creature for gathering all of that mutton up. And they're definitely really fun harvesters to use as well. And pretty much any melee weapon that you can think of, apart from tech melee weapons, I'm pretty sure, these things will be able to wield and use to such a high level of ability. The only real downside to using a Mantis with your tools is the durability factor to it. But if you have Ascendant tools, then you'll have a really great time, as those weapons are not going to break as often. The Mantis is definitely a tame every Ark player should have in their roster, and one every Ark player should tame, and in my opinion, it doesn't get the support that it actually really needs. And finally, in at number 1 is the Carnotaurus. Now, many people wouldn't have expected this thing to be in the number 1 slot, but in my opinion, the Carno is my favourite carnivore in Ark. Yes, I prefer it even above the Baryonyx. The amount of nostalgia I have with this creature and the amount of success I've had with this creature is absolutely insane. And when I did Genesis 1 for the first time, I beat the Master Controller, albeit on Gamma, with the Carnotauruses, and it went extremely well, and it was an extremely fun and useful boss fight for me to have. The Carnotauruses are actually a very viable boss creature, albeit they won't do what a Rex, a Spino, or an Allo can. They are still a really good middleman for doing those Gamma boss fights, and you can definitely push for Beta and Alpha depending on what the fight is, just maybe not with the Master Controller. And did you also know that Carnotaurus, translated from Latin into English, means meatball, which is why I always call my Carnotauruses meatball, partly because it sounds funny, but also it is just accurate to what Carnotaurus actually means. Also, since the Carnotaurus' release, this thing has been TLC'd, now having a second attack where it will headbutt the enemy creature and deal that all-famous bleed ability, which only one other creature on this list so far, being the Allosaurus, actually has. And again, this is something that something like the Spino or the Rex doesn't have, which is why it is extremely useful to have yourself a Carnotaurus, and as always, call this thing Carny Dave. First up, we have got ourselves the Quetzal, and this creature in my opinion is one which is extremely underrated, mainly due to its speed, as a lot of people just say, well, it's so slow, I literally can't use this thing. It is the most useless creature out there, and albeit I do admit that its speed is pretty slow for most people's standards, it still is an extremely useful creature for any general task which you may do in any given Ark scenario. For PvP players and for PvE players, it works both ways, as you can use these things as great metal gatherers, albeit they don't gather metal, they just transfer metal, so maybe resource transferers. And you can even build a base on the back of this thing as well, which can actually be a pretty OP strat in some PvP situations, although I would probably go with a Raft base over a Quetz base, but definitely for PvE use it is a really cool thing to have, and I don't really get why people don't talk about these things quite as much anymore. Next up, we have got the Carbonemys, and most people probably just view this creature as a source of keratin, and albeit it is a great source of keratin, if you need keratin, always kill a Carbonemys. That's just the way you go. Chitin's a lot easier to get from insects, by the way, and you generally get a lot more of it, so I wouldn't generally get keratin for things like saddles, but if you want to have keratin, then you can get keratin from these things. But the thing is, with this creature, it is a great window into the underwater world of Ark, and it's the only real underwater able creature that I'm putting on this list. Like, none of the other creatures here are really great underwater creatures, but maybe apart from the next one actually when I'm thinking about it. But this creature is a really great opening creature into, let's say, ocean exploration, because it's reasonably quick in the water, albeit it's not going to be the fastest, and it spawns on land, so you don't need to go into the ocean, albeit an Ichthyosaurus can be obtained pretty easily these days, and, you know, across all time really, but there's loads of traps if you want to do that for an Ichthyosaurus. Not really strictly necessary, but they spawn in shallow areas and you can get those, but having a carb in the early stages to get some of that oil gathered in the early stages just really seems to help me out. Next up, we have the Beelzebufo, and this creature has to be here. Come on, the king of cementing paste gathering, and albeit some of you may just say, well, this isn't an underrated creature at all, and it's like the best creature for me pretty much because I can get so much cementing paste with it. A lot of people don't use it, and I used to be one of those people a couple of months ago, and I've switched to this thing now, and I really can't go back. Like, it's so consistent in the way it gathers any kind of cementing paste. There's only really one kind, but you can technically say there's many because there's loads of different ways of getting it. I would usually get it from beaver dams, and quite a lot of Ark players do. It's just really easy, and you could obviously craft it as well, but that is quite slow. Whereas with this thing, you can just kill loads of insects, go into the insect cave on the island, and boom, you can have tens of thousands of cementing paste, and you might actually be encumbered because of all of that. But either way, you can just get so much with this thing. It really has to be on this list, and it is also a pretty good underwater creature as well. You know, it really does have quite a lot of agility underwater, albeit it doesn't pack the most amount of damage. it still is extremely useful, especially in ASA actually now, as insects no longer have levels. In at number 7, we have the Baryonyx, and this creature had to be here in my opinion, and a lot of people are actually moving over to creatures like the Shadowmane now for all of their caving needs, but I really do think the Baryonyx deserves a place on the list, and actually deserves a place in everyone's art life for being a great caving creatures, albeit the Shadowmane can do a hell of a lot more than the Baryonyx in quite a lot of aspects. The Baryonyx can also do a couple of things which, you know, the Shadowmane can't. The first main advantage actually to this thing is its taming method is so much easier, and you can obviously, because of that, get it much earlier in the game, and also it can stun creatures underwater as well. Albeit, yeah, not the biggest edge over the Shadowmane, I still think it really has a very useful place as a very great caving creature, and I've used these things for years and years now, and albeit, yes, Shadowmanes are great for doing cave runs, I still always come back to this creature. It's just the general basics for me. I know how to use this creature really well and effectively, and I don't really think that I need anything more than a Baryonyx. And albeit a Shadowmane can be very useful and all, but if I think that you don't really need anything more than the Baryonyx, then maybe do you actually need more than the Baryonyx? And this thing is very easily possible. Not to say that it's a bad creature, it's like, oh, well, you don't really need anything more than it. It is still a very great creature, it's much easier to get your hands on. Next up, we have got the Dimorphodon, and this is a very brief entry, obviously, because the BR for this thing is really short, because there's not too much to say, but they're just really great small pack flying creatures, and they can deal a heck of a lot of damage, especially to players, as they do player-based damage instead of rider-based damage, which can play a huge advantage in a lot of scenarios, and I think people don't give this creature enough credit, and that's why it's on this list. And next up, in the number 5 spot, of course, we have the Carnotaurus. And most people will just be like, well, the Allo's better. There's nothing more to say. But we're talking about underrated creatures here, and obviously the Allo isn't really too much of an underrated creature. Yeah, the Rex gets a lot more attention than it, and the Giga gets a lot more attention than the Allo. But I think the Carno gets even less attention, and especially less attention than this creature actually deserves, as this pretty much my favorite art creature. But I'm not going to be so biased and just put my favorite art creature right then in number 1 spot, because there are a lot of other art creatures which are extremely useful to me, and this is, yes, albeit my favorite, it's still, in my opinion, doesn't deserve to be in the number 1 spot, as there are some more useful underrated creatures, and my personal and emotional bias, I'm not going to play a huge factor into this video, because, you know, I'm making this for you, I'm not making it for me. If I was making it for me, they'd kind of be right in the number 1 spot, but I'm making it for you, so I'm slightly generalising my list here. The reason why I think the Carno is so good, I don't know why it's taken me so long, I've just blabbered on about everything. It deals the bleed ability, it's relatively small compared to things like the Allo, it does a sizable amount of damage, it's got a good health stat, and it's got good mobility. And albeit its weight isn't perfect, it could definitely be a little bit higher, still is really an ideal creature for me. When I think of a carnivore, I go straight to the Carno, and they're ridiculously easy to tame too, especially in ASA, because you can just kill the parents and then press E on that baby, if obviously there's a baby relative to the parents of the Carnotauruses. Next up, we have got the Megalosaurus, and loads of people really like this creature, and I've heard them in my comments, but when I think of bigger Ark YouTubers and when they do their top 10s, I never really hear this creature being mentioned, unless maybe in an aberration circumstance, and albeit they're really useful then, the nighttime still makes up quite a big proportion of your Ark playtime, especially if you're on Operation, then it's 100% of it. But we're not going to be talking about how great this thing is in Operation, because that's pretty much when this creature gets brought up, all everyone talks about. No, on any map, as soon as it turns into nightfall, this creature is so deadly, and it really does pack a punch, and it can even carry creatures around in its mouth and absolutely tear them to shreds to actually save me from a huge clan of Microraptors, if that's even a thing. But yeah, they really do pack a punch in terms of the damage department. They will tear things like the Carno to shreds, even things like Rexes and Alphas and all of that, they can just take out with so much ease, and they're such a small, like, versatile carnivore. It really does help them that they have all of this power behind it, as they're very mobile and very easy to use, very easy to control, and actually, frankly, pretty easy to control. Tame, that's what I meant. Did I something. Either way, they're pretty much easy in every aspect. not as actually so easy to tame in the location they're in, but the actual taming method is very simple. I've kind of gone a bit off here, but you know, it's essentially the Troodon on loads of steroids, and it's so much easier to tame than a Troodon. If the Troodon would never make this list, of course, but yeah, the Megalosaurus is in at number 4. Next up, we have the Velonasaur, and for me, this is just the upgraded Megalosaurus. It deals tons of damage, it can deal range damage, and it's around for all the day. It doesn't just need to be around at night time, albeit the Megalosaurus definitely has its place on this list. The Velonasaur is my preferred creature, and you know, some people may not agree with that. Do you agree with that? Are you a Velonasaur or a Megalosaurus person, or a Carnotaurus person, or a Baryonyx person, or what's your preferred kind of small carnivore? I know I've done many small carnivore top 10 lists before, but I actually want to know what your favourite small carnivores are, so make sure to comment that down below. And, you know, when I think of the Velonasaur, I really do think of sheer power, and albeit when you level up its melee, its actual turrets don't increase in damage. If you just crank that stamina stat like I just did there, you can fire these things for ages into creatures and just absolutely decimate them. And I had a ridiculously high level theory here. It was in the 1000 somethings, and I didn't force tame a particularly high level Velonasaur, so it is kind of looking like it takes ages in this scenario. And obviously you wouldn't use them at this close of a range, but when you have a good level Velonasaur, you really can take out creatures like it's an FPS game, just straight like that. And that's why I absolutely love this creature. Now, the Crystal Wyvern has to be here on the list, and loads of people talk about the Wyvern just being so great and all that, and yes, I do think the Wyvern is a great creature. I just don't think it gets no, what am I thinking of? The Crystal Wyvern, sorry, doesn't get a good enough rep as it should, and the normal Wyverns get the reputation that the Crystal Wyverns should be getting as well, as they are kind of the same creature. It's just they don't come in the Wyvern trenches, and they've got another word in front of their name, so they must be worse variants of these creatures, which obviously are the Wyverns, which you'll know from Scorched Earth, as that's the map they released on. But they're far easier to tame than normal Wyverns, and the Blood Crystal Wyvern is my absolute favourite Wyvern. And the Lightning Wyvern doesn't even come close to the coolness and usefulness of the ability which you can get out of a Blood Crystal Wyvern. And again, I know I'm saying it again, they're so easy to tame. You just need to be level 65 and have been able to either knock out or kill Crystal Wyvern. I think it's knockout. And then you've got that Primal Crystal, and then you can simply just passive tame these things, and boom, like that, you have yourself a Wyvern. And albeit there's no saddles, so they have no armor, but normal Wyverns don't have that either. I really do think these creatures do deserve some consideration in a list of the most underrated creatures in 2024, as hardly anyone seems to talk about these things. And in at number 1, we have got the Bloodstalker, and I had to put this creature here, okay? I really like the Bloodstalker at the moment, and albeit, yes, you can maybe say it isn't the most underrated creature, but for the use that I use it for, I do think it is underrated, and that's why I've chucked it right in the number 1 spot. And as soon as I thought of making this video, this was the first creature that came to mind for me, so I was like, I have to put this thing in at the number 1 spot. It is the greatest water tame, in my opinion, with no comparison whatsoever. And yes, it doesn't have immunity to things like electric eels and jellyfish, but it's so quick, it can get out of there, like, you don't even have to think about it. It's just, it's so agile in the water, it can skim across the top of the water as well, and even if they do get you, it's not going to be the biggest issue. You can get yourself out of there, or you can handily deal the damage to take them all out as well. And they're not just useful in the water like most normal water creatures, which obviously just die if they're not in the water. No, these things can be taken out anywhere and used in all kinds of various situations that aren't in the water as well. And that's what makes this creature so good. And they're just so versatile, but mainly for underwater exploration, underwater travel, and just general underwater things. These are my preferred creature, and they're so good. Underwater caving, underwater getting into underwater bosses. I wouldn't actually bring them into the mode of boss fight. They're not really going to survive there. They're not boss fighting creatures, but for anything that you're already doing underwater apart from the mode of boss fight, these things
are really your perfect creatures, and I don't get why people don't talk about these things being such great underwater creatures as much as I do. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I really hope that you all enjoyed this one. And as always, comment down below what is the most underrated Ark creature in 2024, as I want to know your thoughts, and do you agree with this list? And with that, I'll see you all later.